Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the Phia Group.
Welcome to another episode of our Empowering Plans Podcast. I am Jen McCormick, and I'm here today with Nick Bonds. Want to say hi, Nick?
Hey, Jen. Happy to be here.
We are excited today. We have a lot of content to go over. We are hoping to get some awareness and bring some visibility to some of the trending issues and concerns that we're starting to see across the country. Prepare this so that you know exactly what to do or be aware of or on the lookout for as we are entering the renewal season. I can't believe we're already in the fourth quarter of 2020-23, and Halloween is right around the corner. So we want to make sure that we are outlining for you some of these trending issues so that everyone can be as prepared as possible and react accordingly. So before we dig into some of this case law, we did think it was important for us to bring some awareness to some of the fees. So we know with ACA has been a super hot topic that we have been talking about since its initiation and implementation over 10 years ago. And there are still some fees and taxes that are being associated with how the structure of healthcare benefits can be funded. And one of those fees is the PCORI fee. So initially, this was something that had been intended to be in effect, and the PCORI fee is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Trust Fund fee, which was meant to help people, individuals or patients, in getting sort of decisions based on how they can get healthcare and what would be the appropriate decision for them. So this PCORI fee had been initiated at the outset of ACA and was set to expire. But over time, we've gotten more information and more guidance from the regulators that this is actually going to continue. And it's being extended, what, Nick, an extra 10 years beyond what we originally thought that this fee was going to be in place for?
Yeah, basically the legislation that sort of reinstated the PCORI fee that we all assumed was ending in 2019 effectively continued it through 2029. So it's going to be here for a little while longer still.
And the impact that this is going to have for plan sponsors is making sure that there is an appropriate budget. And as this fee is in place, it is still being adjusted based on the number of lives that are covered under the plan. So there are the different calculation methods that should be considered. But for right now, it's the $3.22 per average number of lives that are covered. So this is a calculation, and this is an item that plans are going to have to be prepared for as we're entering the new plan year, making sure that we have accounted for this and that this is appropriately prepared for and submitted on an annual basis. It is not due until July 31st is when the Form 720 needs to be filed and reported on, but something we should keep our eye on and make sure that we did not have any notes or records with the older expiration date on it. So that is certainly something we will keep our eyes on here at Phia. The other big issue, as we're changing topics here, is about mental health parity. And this is a situation that is not limited to a benefits issue, but this is something across the country that we're seeing case law about the impact that this is having on certain individuals and their lives and how they're able to function and get access to the care that they need. So over the summer, in early August, there were some proposed regulations that had been released by the regulators and some technical releases and some FAQs and the actual report from Congress about some of the information they were finding as it relates to the mental health parity and QTL comparative analysis requirements in the reports. And the reason that we received these and we're excited to get some more guidance is because there was so much ambiguity from plans about what it was they were supposed to do, why they were supposed to do it when it came to the actual NQTL comparative analysis itself. And there was hope that within this new guidance, we'd have some more answers to know exactly what we needed to do. Nick, do you think that plans are getting the answers that they were hoping for with these new proposed rules?
Well, I think the answer plans would really have hoped for is that they didn't have to do it at all. But I think that the rules do offer some really welcome clarity. They help kind of unmuddy some of the waters. I think one of the things that was so daunting about the mental health parity compliance and the comparative analysis requirement is just that there was so much that we didn't even know. There were so few details in the original guidance and requirements. And these proposed regulations, they do take a lot of big steps towards kind of making things more explicit, more clear, and hopefully a little easier to follow. And so we've been following the development of these rules. The notice and comment period on these proposed regulations actually, I think just last week closed. It was extended, the notice and comment period, through October 17th. So, they're going to take into consideration all of the notice, all the comments that the public provided, that the industry provided, and these will probably be slightly modified, and we'll probably see finalized versions of these regs early next year. But some of the really helpful things in the proposed regs, at least, are some added definitions, clearing up the fact that autism spectrum disorder and things like eating disorders are now definitively being defined as mental health and substance use disorders. Terms like the processes, the strategies, the evidentiary standards, factors, all of those things that we in our comparative analysis reports have to break down on a NQTL by NQTL basis. A lot of that is being formalized and codified, and will hopefully make preparing those analyses and actually getting a functioning report to make sure you're compliant will be hopefully a little easier and a little faster and less of a burden on a lot of the plans.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems too, with these new proposed changes and requirements, that the task on the plan or the administrator or any of the vendors that are providing support or administration or assistance for how the plan is operating, there are greater requirements for not only the level of information they need to be providing, as how detailed and how analytical they need to be, but also just the scope. It looks like the regulators are looking for more information, more in-depth information, and not only focusing on what, but the how. And it's becoming very apparent that making sure that individuals who are covered in plans have plan provisions that are increasing their ability to access the much needed care that they can have in parity with the medical and the surgical benefits, even going so far as saying if you cannot address or give enough information about why you would have a particular NQTL in place in your plan, then maybe you shouldn't have it at all. So I think this will be something that a lot of plan sponsors are going to have to be prepared for. And it seems that these regulations, like you said, Nick, are not going to go into effect exactly as they are. And even if this isn't taking effect technically or potentially until 2025, the amount of data and analysis and information that's going to be needed, plans should start to prepare now and start to look at this if they haven't already, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I've worked on some of these reports, and they are not the kind of thing that you want to try to crank out quickly. And I think you're right, too, to point out that the level of detail and the amount of evidence, the specifics, the amount of work that the regulators want plans to show to justify the NQTLs they have in their plan means that this is not the kind of thing that you want to let sit on the back burner for too long.
And as we've gone through these reports too and worked on these here at Phia, we have seen some interesting and nuanced provisions that plans or employers have put into place based on circumstances that were never ever intended to be discriminatory or non-compliant with the parity rules, but we're evolving and we're learning more. And some of the ways that we're learning more information about what to do or what would be appropriate is based on case law. And I know, Nick, you were able to help us and point out some of these interesting cases that maybe are relevant for our discussion so that plans can be prepared and on the lookout for some of the interesting sort of nuanced situations that we're starting to see that maybe plans should be prepared for or addressed when it comes to plan language or plan administration. Do you want to talk about that case in Washington?
Yeah, sure. If rising fees and increased compliance requirements weren't scary enough, there's some really interesting case developments that have kind of been popping up on our radar. Two of the really big ones. I'll start with the Washington case. This is an area that I think has been top of mind for a lot of plan sponsors and a lot of groups. we've seen a fair number of questions about covering weight loss drugs, especially with, these blockbuster weight loss treatments that have hit the market, things like Ozempic and Wegovy, these drugs that can be, life-changing for the people that are taking them, but can be pretty expensive. I don't remember now if it was Ozempic or Wegovy specifically, but the cost for a year of these drugs can easily be $16,000 plus. So even plans that want to do everything they possibly can to, help their participants be as healthy as possible, that's a lot for them to absorb. And some plans just, for whatever reason, can't really justify that level of expense. But there are plans that have specifically started excluding these drugs, and that's where this Washington lawsuit comes in. A woman who worked for a public hospital in Washington State, she was covered under their public health plan, and she was diagnosed basically as obese. She had a high BMI, and her doctor decided the safest treatment for her would be to prescribe Wegovy. So she started paying out of pocket because her plan excluded it, and it did help. She lost 76 pounds, I think, as of the most recent check-in on this case, but that was costing her $2,000+ out of pocket. I think she had to dip into her savings account. There's a New York Times article kind of explaining where she's at on this drug that's really fascinating. But essentially, the hospital plan had a blanket exclusion on all weight loss drugs, which raises a few discrimination concerns in Washington State because I believe obesity is technically classified as a disability under Washington law, which is an area that could trip up other plans in different states. It's always good to remember that state laws that apply to the employers rather than the plan are always going to be a big concern. But this lawsuit is essentially a class action where the woman here is standing in as the class rep for, I think, over several hundred class representatives, basically, that are trying to force plans to cover these drugs. So this still is very early stages. A complaint has been filed, basically. The court hasn't weighed in on this coverage, but I think we're starting to see a lot of plans get more concerned about these drugs coming up and what they can do to mitigate those costs. As this case develops, we might see some of the contours of state requirements starting to take shape and giving a little more of a roadmap for plans on what they can and can't do going forward. So that's a big one that we'll be keeping an eye on.
And I think that this concept of thinking through how this drug has other impacts, it is costly and something for employers to keep in mind when they're looking at their benefits or their exclusions for how they're doing it, is to have a plan of what they intend to do and to make sure that they're doing it in a uniform and a non-discriminatory manner. And what could the impact for this individual be? Is if this individual now, as you noted, has lost 76 pounds, is no longer within the category of obesity, is healthier. Oftentimes there are other situations or other health factors that are in play as well when someone might have an issue, and maybe this is having a positive impact on the other health conditions that might be related to that as well. And what is the savings to the plan in those circumstances by no longer falling into that category? Or is the risk of heart attack lower, or other medications going to be lower as well? So maybe the one-time cost for the year to get the weight loss that's desired can offset the potential other costs for being out of work or being sick or the other co-health factors that might exist. Certainly something to weigh.
Yeah, and I think in the lawsuit, they actually sort of raise the argument that the plan is being maybe short-sighted in how it is limiting its coverage to the only other viable alternative treatment that was potentially an option here, basically arguing that the options here to treat obesity for this woman medically was either a medication or bariatric surgery. And if the plan covers bariatric surgery, that, is an invasive procedure that can have a lot of complications that can lead to more problems down the line that, you hopefully won't see taking a prescription drug like an Ozempic or a Wegovy. And all of that, like you were saying, Jen, is all tied together. If a patient can mitigate their weight issues, that can help down the line with joint issues, with heart issues, with lung issues. So it's really important to kind of take in a broader perspective of what you're actually excluding when you're excluding some of these medications.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into this case that's going on in Utah about wilderness therapy and what the broader implication is going to be for some of these benefits and actually doing a true analysis of what is being covered, what is being excluded, and what the longer term impact could potentially be, not only for the plan members, but for the families as well. Because when we're talking about self-funded plans, we're not only talking about the employees, but oftentimes the employees have dependents, and those individuals are covered in the plan as well. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as well. Do you want to give us a little bit of a background about this case?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a Utah case coming out of a district court ruling, basically. So it's a little further down the line, but this case could get appealed. We'll see kind of where it goes. But essentially, a health plan in Utah had an exclusion for the standard exclusions for things like medical necessity and experimental investigational. The plan also had specific exclusions for wilderness therapy. And there was a participant under the plan who had a dependent daughter, and she was struggling with mental health issues. She got to the point of, massive depression and self-harm, and it was not going in a good direction. So several of the treatments she underwent that seemed to help included residential treatment and specifically a wilderness therapy. The plan denied coverage for the wilderness therapy, saying that it was unproven and that it was essentially experimental and investigational and not medically necessary for the dependent daughter. The plan denied, the participants appealed, it went to a second appeal, it went to an IRO, and at every level, essentially the claims were denied. So it got to the point of them filing this lawsuit, and the district court in Utah essentially found that the plan misapplied its exclusion language here, and the court made an interesting argument under ERISA. Two of the claims that the participant brought were essentially arguing that this denial was a violation under the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, and that it was an ERISA violation because the plan's language was ambiguous and was being applied arbitrarily and capriciously. All of those words should be raising massive red flags in everybody's mind if they work with ERISA plans, because that is exactly what you don't want. Basically, the court looked at the plan's exclusion language and reasoned that it was worded very, very vaguely. It was worded so broadly that the wilderness therapy exclusion arguably didn't mean anything. It could mean all sorts of different treatments. Essentially it could be interpreted to have multiple meanings. So the court looked at that and said that it was just basically arbitrary and it couldn't be administered in a uniform and consistent manner and was problematic. And then going even further, the court looked at every stage of the appeals process of that claim and said that the plan and its administrator didn't really show their work. They didn't cite clearly to the language in the plan that they were using to justify their denial, and they didn't point to their logic that they relied on to conclude that that exclusion applied to these claims. So the court essentially walked through every step of the appeals process and said that the plan was not being uniform and consistent, that it was being arbitrary in interpreting its language, that it was being arbitrary and capricious in how it applied its language, and essentially remanded the case back to the plan administrator to sort of reinterpret all the way from square one on that basis. That would scare me, honestly, hearing that the plan went through multiple levels of appeal and felt like it was doing what it had to do every step of the way, and then gets into court and realizes, oh, we didn't have all of our bases covered. Does any of that kind of jump out at you, Jen?
Yeah, I think that this has the potential to have huge implications for other plans in the way that they are currently administering and making decisions for how claims should be processed. And not even necessarily just limited to mental health type of benefits or wilderness therapy type of benefits, but all benefits. This analysis and being this detailed and going into understanding all of the nuances and the circumstances and the medical opinions and the conclusions that they ultimately come to, this should give a lot of pause for plan administrators to really reflect on what it is that ERISA requires them to do as a fiduciary, and make sure that there's a high threshold and there's lots of responsibilities and duties and obligations with being a plan sponsor and a plan fiduciary. And that gives me a little bit of pause and hesitation if I was the plan sponsor to say, am I doing what I need to be doing?
Yeah, and I think specifically speaking to what the court here is saying the plan should be doing, there were some good quotes in this case. The court was pointing out that, after the initial denial, the participant went to the doctors sent in all of this information justifying like, hey, this is a genuine medical necessity. The patient needs this type of care. This is how it's helping. This is what it's doing. And basically the administrator and the plan didn't really engage with any of that. They didn't respond to that additional information that was provided to them on subsequent levels of appeal. And the court stressed that the plan cannot shut its eyes to readily available information and fail to engage with the opinions of plaintiffs and treating caregivers. They have a duty to address medical opinions, particularly those that may contradict the plan's findings, saying this is the core of a meaningful dialogue. And the court stressed that the plan still has its own discretionary authority. It's not required to defer to those opinions, but it also can't just ignore them and keep denying. So they're really trying to stress that the plan sponsor, the plan administrator, they need to have a meaningful dialogue with participants who are appealing claims, because this is high stakes stuff.
This is high stakes stuff. And if we're talking about wrapping all of these cases and this information together, when we're talking about PCORI fees, the ACA, things that are on our radar, we're talking about mental health parity rules and compliance, and now ERISA and potential ERISA complications and violations and penalties and fees. If you had to summarize our discussion today for a couple of takeaways for plan sponsors as they're in the fourth quarter and getting ready for 2024, what would you say? What are the top couple of items that you think everyone should be aware of to make sure that they are in good shape and they know exactly whether it's looking at their internal processes and procedures, their external documents, doing reviews to make sure there's no gaps in understanding or misalignment and how something should be administered? Can you summarize for us some of the top takeaways for plan sponsors?
I think the big thing to remind everyone, especially as we get towards the end of the year and we've got holidays coming up that everybody's going to be out of office for weeks at a time. I think a big thing just to be mindful of is that plan sponsors need to be sure that they don't take their eye off the ball, really. That you need to be mindful of the developing compliance requirements, what kind of fees you have to pay, how have those increased, what steps do you need to take to make sure that your plan language is strong, that your benefits are organized the way that you need them to be, that your exclusion language, that your limitations are up to snuff. And then, like you were saying, with not just your language, but your processes and your procedures and the steps you're taking when you're handling claims, making sure that all of that is given the due care and consideration that it deserves. And I think really remembering that the plan has a duty to make sure it's crossing every T and dotting every I and not missing any steps along the way.
Thank you, Nick. And on behalf of myself and Nick, thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of our Empowering Plans podcast.